Professor William Maley. He's a Professor of Diplomacy at the Asia Pacific College of Diplomacy at the Australian National University. Bill, as we call him, has also served as Foundation Director of the Asia Pacific College until recently. Earlier on, Professor Bill taught for many years at various institutions. He was in the School of Politics at the University of New South Wales Australian Defence Force Academy, and he served as visiting professor at the Russian Diplomatic Academy. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you're not taking notes as to Professor Bill's history, because you will run out of ink. Let me continue. He was a visiting fellow at the Centre for the Study of Public Policy at the University of Strathclyde and a visiting research fellow in the Refugee Studies program at Oxford University. He is a barrister at the High Court of Australia, Vice President of the Refugee Council of Australia and a member of the Australian Committee of the Council for Security Cooperation in the Asia Pacific. He's also on the editorial board of the journal Global Responsibility to Protect. In 2002, he was appointed a member of the Order of Australia. In 2009, he was elected as a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia. If anyone else needs to take their seat, please go ahead and do so. There's plenty of room for everyone. Now, Professor Bill has a very interesting case study about Afghanistan to present to you this evening, amongst other things. So I ask you all to welcome him warmly to the floor.
Thank you, Siobhan, for those kind words, and thank you to Forum Australia and Mohammed Ali for giving me the opportunity to speak this evening. It's not the first time I've spoken at Forum Australia, and I think it's a wonderful community initiative, bringing people together to listen to discussion of issues that are actually of fundamental importance to matters of public policy. What I want to do this evening is offer some broad perspectives on how aid fits into development assistance and on some of the challenges that confront aid. And then I want to conclude with a rather horrifying case study from Australian experience, which does shed light on some of the difficulties that arise when one is attempting to implement complex projects in different parts of the world. And I suppose the bottom line here is that there is a kind of ineluctable tension between, on the one hand, the recognition that transparency is, in the abstract sense, a good thing for ensuring the quality of program delivery, and yet on the other hand, a considerable reluctance on some people to endure the burden of responsibility if it's not going to show them in a particularly good light. And that, I don't think is going to disappear anytime soon as a problem. Development, of course, is an extremely multifaceted phenomenon. It can be seen as something which has predominantly social dimensions, economic dimensions, political dimensions, and how they come together and fit together, work together, is something which is likely to vary according to the character of the particular environment in which projects are being implemented. A development project in a small island state in the South Pacific may well throw up different kinds of challenges from those that one might encounter in a place like Somalia or Afghanistan or Iraq, where the environments of these are different. It's also the case that there are quite fundamental divergences that can be found in the literature over what kinds of approaches to fostering development are the most appropriate. And when Catherine in her presentation mentioned the shift in emphasis which had been notable in Australian policy towards the notion of growth as a contributing factor to development, she, in a sense, was capturing an important element of the debate that had gone on earlier involving people like Peter Bauer, who wrote a famous book called Descent on Development, which was much more in favour of fostering the entrepreneurial initiative that's often present in society, rather than having centrally directed projects which do have the risk of miscarrying. And that's subsequently been taken up in writings of people like James Scott, who had a very famous book called Seeing Like a State, which looked at the difficulties of mobilising information in order to organise development outcomes. It's also the case that within broad debates on development, there can be very different points of emphasis that individual practitioners might see as fundamentally important. Good governance, capacity building, sustainability, local ownership. These are all terms that bubble to the surface when international aid and development assistance are being discussed. And in a sense, one can make a strong case for all of these particular approaches, but often the challenge is how you can seek to realise objectives of this sort simultaneously when resources are scarce and there may be pressures on from different kinds of groups to give emphasis to one rather than another. It's also the case that there is a potential distinction of value to be drawn between emergency humanitarian assistance and longer-term development assistance, recognising, however, that what one does in the short term in response to something like the earthquake in the park is likely also to set the terms upon which future longer-term objectives can realistically be pursued. That very often you have one chance to get things right in these kinds of environments, and if you get the settings wrong at the outset, a set of interests will likely crystallise around even dysfunctional ways of doing things that may make it very difficult politically to reorient a program at some later point, even if lessons learned analyses suggest that doing things in a quite different fashion might be the more rewarding approach. So it's very much an environment in which the issues are pretty deeply complex and challenging. And that's, of course, one of the areas where potentially much is to be gained from having an intrinsically critical approach which re-evaluates and re-scrutinises the ways in which things are done. That said, however, about 12 years ago, one of my finest PhD students, Dr. Fiona Terry, who now works for the ICRC in Geneva, published a book from her PhD thesis called Condemned to Repeat the Paradox of Humanitarian Action. And she was particularly concerned to explore why it was that similar mistakes that she observed in various missions in which she was deployed, and she'd been chief of mission in MSF in Liberia before coming to do her PhD, seemed to recur. And the particular cases that she looked at were the militarisation of refugee camps. But the conclusions that she reached at the end of her book focused, among other things, on the dangers for aid agencies, particularly private NGOs funded by donations, of exposing too radically what might have gone wrong in particular exercise, on the basis that the public hearing of things of this kind will not necessarily understand the complexities and might respond simply by cutting off their donations in a way that would then affect the operation of an agency across a whole range of different theatres of operation and activity. And I think it's a shrewd warning that she put forward, and the implication is, again, that there is a tension between an in-principle commitment to transparency and lesson learning, and on the other hand, a recognition that some of the consequences of engaging vigorously in such a process can be destructive. Now, there are a lot of issues that will come up in the context of appraising development activities. Development for whom? What kind of criteria are going to be used to appraise the performance of aid projects? You can have formalistic criteria which are based essentially on preset performance benchmarks, and that turns evaluation into a list-picking exercise that may not tell you very much at all about what's been achieved. You can have financial criteria which are really based on whether you have adequate auditing and accounting of financial processing. Again, that doesn't necessarily tell you much about outcomes. Then you can have a more rigorous outcome-based set of criteria which are concerned with whether beneficiaries have been persistent. But there, of course, one of the challenges that you face is that who the exact beneficiaries are of a development or a project will not be intrinsically obvious in all circumstances. It may be that there is a small category of people who are obvious immediate beneficiaries of the project. But a project's greatest effect is not necessarily felt in the intended consequences of the project. Sometimes unintended consequences of the project can be just important in either a negative or a positive sense when we come to appraise what the impact has been. And just as a sideline, if one looks at the international involvement in Afghanistan over the last 15 years, I think you can build an argument that the greatest effect on that country has not been through direct military activities or direct aid projects, but rather the way in which indirectly, the international presence has opened the country to the influence of forces of globalisation, which have seen 16 million mobile phones disseminated in the country, creating new ways of networking for people who are involved in entrepreneurial activity, linking the population to the wider world in a way that simply would not have been seen as part of the conscious objectives of international involvement back in 2001, 2002, when the framework for so many projects came together. And this is important to bear in mind. Development assistance in failed states or fractured states is particularly difficult because any kind of intervention is likely to have potential political consequences. Some will benefit, some will lose, and no matter what commitments one make to principles to underpin one's activities, what one actually does is likely to be interpreted in political terms by local actors. So that's the problem. And there's, again, an overarching issue which, in a way, haunts all public policy matters, not just international aid, which is that of how money is used in one particular area might be otherwise used. Whether there were better or more rewarding ways in which funds used on one particular project might have been deployed. And this is always an issue which comes up whether we're talking about social security in Australia or whether we're talking about health policy or education policy. One can always make the different mechanisms for the disbursement of funding and alternative uses to which resources might have been put. Now, let me conclude by saying a little bit about the particular case study that I've mentioned here. I could go into a lot of things relating to Afghanistan.
Please keep going, Professor.
Keep going? Okay. I could talk about the military's role and how militaries function as deliverers of assistance as opposed to civilian aid agencies or NGOs. And there, the danger for militaries is they tend to partner with really unappetizing people to get things done. People are lucky or a hole in the middle is gone. You can run the risk of perverse incentives and the diminishing of social capital. A nice example of this is something that people should always bear in mind in the aid area. Came in the 1980s and 90s when NGOs were looking for projects to do in Afghanistan, and they started to embark on the cleaning out of irrigation channels for carriers in rural Afghanistan. So people would seek funding from international agencies to clean up the carriers. Now this was actually something that the community used to do as a cooperative activity without being paid up to that point. And what happened when NGOs came in offering to do funded projects in this area is people developed new skills in writing grant applications, but they lost the skill of working cooperatively in the community in order to do something which delivered the collective good. And that's always something worth bearing in mind, because that kind of perverse effect can bubble up in a lot of different contexts. And of course, outsiders coming in often don't have the ability to access the tacit knowledge about the complexities of an operating environment that the local population may have, and which may be embedded in their ways of doing things that might look irrational or peculiar to outside observers, but one which nonetheless makes sense in the context of the particular circumstances that they confront. What I want to talk about in this case study is the danger of outsourcing, because perhaps in the last 20 years or so, what we've seen is a number of government-based aid agencies have been moving increasingly into the direction of what one might call contract management, or more crudely a fire and forget approach, under which some private commercial organisation will be contracted to implement a particular project in a country, and it won't necessarily be monitored all that precisely as it does so. The expectation instead being that at the end of the day there will be a proper set of audited accounts which will meet the requirements of financial transparency, and which hopefully will deliver goods at the end of the day. Now, I think there is actually great danger for government-funded aid agencies in going too far down this particular path, because if the specific expertise that can be built into government aid agencies is hollowed out in favour simply of contract management, it may only be a matter of time before other agencies of government begin to say, well, we can do contract management just as well as they can, and so why do we need to have a specialised aid agency within the ranks of a government as a whole? That's a wider political kind of concern. The particular case that attracted my attention first came up in late 2011, but I happened to be in Afghanistan and I met an outstandingly gifted young person called Maley Ibrahimi. And I would add there is a happy ending to this story. He was in my office this morning at the ANU, so I'd say that in advance. Who was recommended to me by both the European Union office and an Afghan organisation, the liaison office. And he had been a staffer of the International Crisis Group and had then been recruited by the Crisis States Research Unit of the London School of Economics to be its representative in Afghanistan. In the meantime, he did an honours degree in international relations from the London School of Economics by correspondence from Kabul, which in itself is quite an achievement. And those who recommended him to see me said that he was one of the most outstanding potential candidates to do a PhD that they had ever encountered. So I came to the same conclusion. So we encouraged him at the ANU to put in an application to be admitted to a PhD program at the ANU, which was rapidly approved. Gareth Evans, now the ANU Chancellor, previously the Australian Foreign Minister, was one of his referees and wrote one of the most radioactive, glowing references I've ever seen to anybody. And then to fund his studies, he applied for an Australian leadership award, which had been, the administration of which had been outsourced to a Brisbane-based company called GRM International. This was where things began to get interesting, because in the meantime, Niamatullah had been offered a visiting fellowship at the Free University of Berlin and went off there, and it was from Berlin that he had to put in his application for scholarship. The documentation that he'd been supplied stated that it was necessary for him to have his degree certificate authenticated by the Afghan Ministry of Higher Education. Now, if there's one thing that it is very clear, it is that the Afghan Ministry of Higher Education is unable meaningfully to authenticate a degree certificate from the London School of Economics. So I rang the Australian who was head of the GRM office in Kabul and asked whether this was necessary, and he said no, he doesn't need to do it. Being a suspicious type, I then sent him an email which confirmed the substance of the conversation. I phoned him that way. And months went by, and then Niamatullah heard that lots of other people had been interviewed and that the interviewing process was concluded and he hadn't been interviewed. And this seemed rather strange to me. So I rang the same Australian official whom I had earlier encountered, and he said that he would look into it. Then Niamatullah received rejection letter saying that he wasn't competitive for a scholarship. Now, neither Gareth Evans nor I was especially impressed by that, and I rang up again and queried the Australian official what was going on, and he said, we made a mistake. We had 4 people with similar names and we sent him the wrong feedback. What we should have told him was that his application was rejected because he didn't have his degree certificate authenticated by the Ministry of Higher Education. So I at that point responded, well, that's interesting because I rang you to see whether that was necessary and you said it wasn't. And I sent you an email to that effect. And there was this deathly hush. I'm glad I wasn't paying for the phone call. And after about what seemed like a minute and a half silence, he said, I remember that telephone call. Let me deal with it. So the next day, I got an email from him that said, I'm trying to sort this out. And then the next sentence was, please do not tell Ozzy about this. And at that point, I started getting very, very worried about what was going on. And Niamatullah was then interviewed, but heard nothing and heard nothing and heard nothing. I, in the meantime, had responded to the email about not mentioning this to Ozzy by sending the gentleman back an email in which I said, well, I'm happy to give you an opportunity to sort things out, but if I'm not entirely satisfied by the way in which this is handled, I reserve the right to raise this not only with Ozzy, but with the Senate Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade References Committee, which is having an inquiry into Australia's overseas development programs in Afghanistan. And I then got an email back which was somewhere between panic and hysteria, which said, I do not think the Senate Committee would be interested in this, which led me to think that the Senate Committee was likely to be very interested in me. Anyway, anyway, the upshot was that the Senate committee held its hearings. Maley didn't get any kind of response. I got in touch with Ozzy and they said, oh, he's been sent a letter telling me he didn't get a scholarship. I contacted him, he said he received nothing. I then got in touch with Ozzy, they went back and said, this was an oversight on our part, we will send him a letter. Well, he received nothing by the time the committee met, so I tabled a lot. I tabled the correspondence, all the correspondence. And it then turned out, not during the course of the committee hearings, and not through testimony to that committee, but through an appearance of the Aussie Director General before another parliamentary committee, that the entire program had actually been suspended no later than September 2012 because of suspected corruption in the program. And I later found out from an Afghan friend of mine who was well placed that the company concerned had not been paying some of its Afghan taxes, and that had created an opportunity for some of the local staffers to blackmail in order to try to get their friends listed for scholarships. And ultimately, under freedom of information, there came out a briefing note that was sent to their minister on 17th of August 2012, talking about cases of fraud in the program. Now, what was interesting about this from the point of view of our wider issue was not the fate of Mr. Ibrahimi, because Maley then got an even more prestigious Endeavour Scholarship, which is administered by the Education Department as the prestige, globally competitive scholarship for doing PhDs in Australian universities, and that's why he's now living in PhD class. What was significant was that even though there was a parliamentary committee that was specifically investigating aid to Afghanistan, not a word was presented from government circles to the committee about corruption being involved. This led the committee in its final report not to mince its words, and it went through the whole case in some considerable detail, and in paragraph 9.39 of the report it said, well, I'll read you through paragraph 9.36. Surprisingly, Aussie informed the Senate Foreign Affairs Potential Trade Legislation Committee on the 14th of February 2013 that it was certainly aware of allegations of fraud in the program. The Director General Aussie, Mr. Peter Baxter, told the committee during a public hearing that the Australia Awards program in Afghanistan had been suspended in August 2012 because of allegations of corruption in the administration of the program. It should be noted that Mr. Baxter did not volunteer this information, but provided it in response to a direct question about whether the scholarships were being on-sold for profit. And then 9.39. The committee is at a loss to understand why an explanation for suspending the program was not provided to the committee in December 2012, soon after Professor Maley aired his concerns publicly about the program. Moreover, Aussie did not mention any fraud-related matters for suspending the program in answer to a follow-up written question on notice from the committee about Professor Maley's concern. Now, I quote that not because I'm concerned with malfeasance, although I think some of the people running the program in Afghanistan itself probably have been lucky enough to end up in jail, but because I think it illustrates this deeper problem of accountability and transparency, that moving from transparency as something as an abstract good towards something that one rigorously applies in circumstances where the consequences of transparency are likely to be adverse for the standing or reputation of an organisation or senior staff is actually a very difficult thing to procure. And I don't know whether this particular episode had anything to do with the ultimate winding of Aussie after its incorporation in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, but the mere fact that one of the contractors actually wrote putting it in writing in an email asking me not to tell Aussie what was going on, I think tells you also something about a particular culture that can come to surround this process of subcontracting, perhaps not on a gross scale, but certainly in this particular case. Enough, I think, to illuminate some of the deeper and more intractable problems of managing accountability and transparency in the shape of international aid. Thank you very much.
whether to be terrified or excited when someone brings a full volume of a Senate committee report to them. But you used it to touch on, well, to zero in, in fact, with laser-like efficacy on two very important issues in this field. Firstly, the big elephant in the room, which is corruption. And secondly, this, what you mentioned earlier, was this idea of matching aid projects to local needs and to cultural structures and to the existing local expertise. And I'm sure you've sparked many questions in the audience for later on. Ladies and gentlemen, our final